Have you ever felt like you have a long lost sibling? The book The Berry Pickers follows two people and their journey into adulthood. One, a boy who lost his sister at a young age, and another, a girl who is that sister. This book has an interesting take on generational trauma and issues that are passed down biologically, as well as things that are passed on through nurture. As Peter's debut novel, I think this book was very insightful and interesting. So let's dive into the plot, characterization, and themes of The Berry Pickers. The Berry Pickers has an interesting narration style. The style is similar to most books, but it did have an air of stream of consciousness. The story was led by the thoughts and ideas of the characters. Oregon State defines stream of consciousness as a narrative style that tries to capture a character's thought process in a realistic way. It's an interior monologue, but it's also more than that because it's mimicking the non-linear way our brains work. Stream of consciousness narration includes a lot of free association, looping repetitions, sensory observations, and strange or even non-existent punctuation and syntax, all of which helps us to better understand the character's psychological state and worldview. It's meant to feel like you have dipped into the stream of the character's consciousness, or like you're a fly on the wall of their mind. I would not say that this book is completely in stream of consciousness because there's still a clear narrative and timeline. However, there are many moments in this book that feel like stream of consciousness. You're in the heads of these characters. The way the ideas are presented feels like you're being led by the whims and thoughts of these characters. I would argue that there is a dual conflict in this book. Both characters are trying to pick themselves up after the kidnapping. However, both of them take very different paths. Norma is trying to figure out why something has never felt quite right, and Joe is trying to figure out a way to deal with grief and guilt. Both of these characters find what they're looking for by the resolution of this book. In the exposition, we meet both of these characters, Joe and Ruthie, aka Norma, with their parents picking berries for the summer before they go back to Nova Scotia for the school year. They are Indigenous Canadians, and as such, they deal with the issues that many natives deal with. They are poor. They are forced to go to a white person school. They are losing their culture, but they are a happy, happy family. That is until everything goes wrong. One day, Ruthie disappears, and Joe has to deal with the fact that he is the last person who saw her. Joe's story follows him as he watches his brother die, and then from that point forward, he never recovers. He finds a relationship with a woman in town, but he beats her and then runs away. He never finishes school, so he's wandering around doing manual labor until he ends up back on the farm where Ruthie first disappears. He avoids his family during all of this time. He finds out he has a daughter. He stays away. He finds out his father passes. He stays away. He doesn't know why, but he stays away. He feels like it's the better way for his family, I guess. Then he's finally forced to go home when he is diagnosed with terminal cancer. Norma, the name her new parents gave Ruthie, lives with her family. Her parents lie to her, and anytime Norma has memories of the past or dreams of what happened, they gaslight her. They tell her that she's always been part of the family, and they make up stories that fit that narrative. Norma doesn't love her life, but she tries her best to be the daughter her parents need. Norma's mother, Lenore, has a difficult time with anxiety and other neuroses, and she doesn't let Norma live her life. Norma spends most of her time inside, away from other children, and she often deals with her mother having headaches. Norma does have one reprieve. She's able to talk to her aunt's friend, Alice, who must be a therapist. Alice helped Norma to deal with her repressed emotions and feelings. Norma eventually goes to college and gets married, but she, like Joe, also has a difficult time with her family life. When she loses her first child, Norma isn't able to recover and she chooses not to have any more children and give up her marriage because she lived in the shadow of her mother's lost children. When Norma's mother is in an old folks' home, Norma finds out what happens and that she wasn't adopted, but kidnapped. At the climax of the book, Norma finds out that she wasn't adopted and finds a connection to her family because Aunt June saved an article in the newspaper for her. June takes Norma to her rock, and they're able to make the connection with the owner of the farm and Joe. Norma is then able to make contact with May, and she gets up and goes to meet with the family. When Joe and Norma meet for the first time and talk, this is the climax of both of their stories. Joe is able to find happiness at the end of his life, and Norma is able to fill the cracks in her understanding. This book had a beautiful resolution. I thought that Joe's passing was very beautiful. He was able to say goodbye to his daughter and forgive himself before he moved on. It's clear that Joe didn't really believe in the next life, but since Joe couldn't really find peace during his life, his death was very powerful indeed. Norma is also able to make connections with the person she was and find the sister she always wanted. She also makes peace with Aunt June, and I hope that she was able to move on with her life as well. All in all, this was beautifully written. I love the way that Peters jumps from time to time in her stream of consciousness style of writing. It's easy to follow the characters' thoughts and ideas as they are remembering things from the past and relating them to their present. So let's move to characterization. I think that Joe is one of the saddest characters that I've ever read. His grief and inability to deal with his own feelings make him a lost man. I don't know many men like Joe personally, but literature is littered with men like him. Men who leave their families and the people they love because they don't feel worthy or they don't feel like they are worth working on. So they leave thinking that everyone is better off without them. Men who try to find themselves at the bottom of the bottle or find themselves in nature. It takes Joe on his deathbed to really take stock of the person he is, and even then, he doesn't fully understand himself. Not really. Joe sees himself as a series of mistakes. He didn't save Rufy. He didn't save Charlie. He didn't fight for him either. He let his anger get the best of him, and he hurt the person he loved more than himself. And then instead of dealing with it, he just runs away. He doesn't deal with his feelings. He feeds his guilt by torturing himself and by taking himself out of the equation. I think there are two beautiful moments with Joe when he talks to the women that he met in the woods that really help us see where he is. The woman is like a spirit guide to Joe, helping him tap into his emotions. She says the things he needs to hear. That he's not inherently bad, that he's capable of finding redemption. I think this was an interesting perspective on how racism can impact you. Although most of Joe's feelings are self-inflicted, many times he overheard people talking about him and his family in such negative ways. As a boy, it's hard not to internalize that. I loved this quote. Every one of us is alive today comes from something bad done to the family that came before us. You being alive is a goddamn miracle. So no more talk about sour blood. Own your mistakes, make amends, and move on. We owe it to those who didn't make it. It's such practical advice, and the advice that Joe needed in that dark moment. Joe is characterized largely by sadness. He lets his sadness and guilt eat at him. He is a representative of so many other men like him, who let their feelings get the best of them and feel like no one can understand, instead of being like the women around him, who feel their feelings and talk to each other about their feelings. Here's a quote from the book. When you're an only child, semi-imprisoned, books become more than paper between hard cardboard, more than alphabet organized into words and printed on a page. Norma was my favorite character. I related to her for a number of reasons. One, she wanted to be a writer, but that didn't work out for her, so she became a teacher instead. She also was adopted like I was. However, I knew my whole life I was adopted, instead of being told that my past was a lie. But I get what it's like to be an adopted only child. There was just so much about her that I could relate to. Norma is so resilient and self-aware. She knew what was best for her, and she wasn't afraid to take it. You might say she was a coward, or she took the easy way out by not having children again. But from her past experiences, she knew that she would rather be alone than to make their children suffer like she did. Unlike Jo, Norma didn't grow up thinking she was bad because of racism. However, it's clear that she's aware the effect she had on her mother. She thought about her actions and how they would affect her mother and her father, and then she chose to act in a way that wouldn't bother either of them. Norma was never treated differently because of the color of her skin, but she didn't really feel at home with her family. She felt isolated. She was able to talk to Alice, but it's unclear if that really helped. Both Jo and Norma are characterized by events that happened in their past that they didn't really get a chance to deal with until they were in their 50s. As a reader, we get to see their pain play out over their lives as Norma finds out where she came from and Jo tells us about his life. It's hard to watch these events play out, but I do feel like the ending was a happy moment. We see how people are dealing with their generational trauma. May and Ben are trying to learn the dying language of their ancestors. Norma is able to connect with her biological mother and her roots. Jo unfortunately dies, but is able to make amends with Ruthie and his daughter. It feels like the end of their trauma and a place where everyone can move on. So let's move to themes. One of the most prevalent themes in this book is about the relationship between mothers and daughters. Norma has about 4 mothers in this book. She has 2 moms and 2 aunts who take care of her and are responsible for the woman she becomes. I think that many people saw themselves in Norma and Lenore's relationship. Their relationship was fraught with miscommunication, secrets, and love. It's difficult to be a mother, but it's even harder when you have undealt with trauma. It's clear that Lenore made a number of bad decisions during her period of grief, and then Ruthie had to deal with that undealt trauma for the rest of her life. Alice tries to explain that Lenore's trauma is not Norma's trauma, but that doesn't seem to make an impact on Norma's life. Instead, Norma just takes Lenore's trauma and makes it her own. Yes, Norma is an introvert, but many of her tendencies come from her mother isolating her and making her live on her own. I think an important part of this book was watching Lenore get old. Norma becomes the caretaker of her mother. This not only opens the door to her learning about her mother's secrets, but it is also something that many people have to go through. Our parents take care of us, and then we take care of them. The struggles Norma has taking care of her mother as she gets dementia and having to put her in a home is something that many people can relate to. This is a difficult time and is something that should be seen in literature and not just in real life, because catharsis. Although Norma's relationship with her mother was fraught with hardship, Norma has many important mother figures in her life. June and Alice become like mothers to Nora since Lenore is not able to deal with her own anxiety. They give her advice and they try to help her navigate the complicated relationship between Norma and Lenore. Because they weren't able to have children of their own, they were able to take Norma in. I think June and Norma's close relationship makes the betrayal of Norma's parentage so difficult for Norma. To her, it makes sense that her parents would have lied to her, but June lying to her was so difficult. Parents have to keep some information secret from their children, but keeping Norma's early life from her and gaslighting her was cruel. She wasn't able to deal with the trauma until well into her adult life, and not much about her life could be changed. I think that this experience is something that many people relate to. Their parents have kept some secrets from them, and it manifests themselves later in life. And this causes undue amounts of damage. Fortunately, Norma was able to meet her biological mother and heal some of her wounds. I love the way that Ruthie's family embraces her back into their family, almost as if no time was lost at all. We could learn a number of things from these mother and daughter relationships, but what was your takeaway from them? I'd love to hear your thoughts about the mother and daughter relationships in the comments below. All of the characters in this book are affected by loss and the overwhelming grief that this loss brings. I think this is supposed to be a representation of them losing their culture. This book starts with Ruthie's disappearance. We watch the way the rest of her family deals with this loss. It appears to hit their mother the hardest because she openly expresses her loss, but every one of them suffers in their own way. Then all of their pain is compounded when they lose Charlie. Each of their grief manifests in different ways. However, the one we really get to see is Joe's. As I mentioned earlier, Joe struggles with his grief throughout the novel. I thought an interesting quote that explained this was, "Anger is exhausting. Holding on to it will drain the life out of you." Joe let his grief and anger eat him until there was nothing left. He chooses to live in his pain instead of moving on with his life. It is similar to what happens to Norma. Let's look at this quote. "I found it strange that no word exists for a parent who loses a child. If children lose their parents, they are orphans. If a husband loses his wife, he's a widower. But there's no word for a parent who loses a child. I've come to believe that this event is just too big, too monstrous, too overwhelming for words. No words could ever describe the feeling, so we leave it unsaid." Norma chooses to live with her grief instead of trying to move on. We know this is different from Jo because she saw what dead children did to her mother, Lenore. But they both choose a life alone rather than trying to make things work. Grief is a strange thing, especially if it's generational grief. Everyone has their own path to healing, and it was interesting to see these two on their path. Overall, I thought this book dwelt in sadness and the grief of these characters. Even though this book ends happily, I think the tone of the book matched the message being portrayed. Not all stories are happy. Even though it's difficult to read books where people are struggling with their emotions and trauma, I believe it's important to read a diversity of stories, and the books that feel a bit uncomfortable are important. The themes covered in this book are significant, and hopefully by reading them, people can relate to the characters and heal through them or learn from them. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of According to Your English Teacher. If you like this episode, please make sure to leave a review of the podcast or write a comment. Also, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you can catch the next episode. I know there's a larger community of people who love to talk about books, and I want to be a place to grow that community. I have a TikTok and an Instagram, and I would love to connect with you there. My Instagram account is according.to your English teacher, and my TikTok account is @yet33. You can also send me an email at yet33@gmail.com. I'd like to leave you with one last quote. "Let those tears flow. Alice always said that holding tears in is like holding in pee. It's gonna hurt eventually, so you might as well let them go as soon as you feel them." This episode was written by me, Sam Gunther, and edited by Dallin Gunther. The music was composed by Tom Brinton. Tune in next week as we discuss The Fury by Alex Michaelides.